Hi, my name is Cole Hughes, and today we're going to be looking at the idea of emerging worship. What is emerging worship? How is it any different than the other forms of worship that we see in the Christian church today? We're going to be looking at these ideas and a lot more as we go through our time together. So sit back, grab a cup of coffee, and let's look at emerging worship. Before diving into what emerging worship is, it's first important to have an understanding of what worship is. Many people have undertaken to define the word worship and what exactly that means for the Christian. For example, listen to what Billy Graham says about worship. Worship in the truest sense takes place only when our full attention is on God, on His glory, power, majesty, love, and compassion. Listen also to what John Piper says about worship. True worship is a valuing or a treasuring of God above all things. In the Bible, often the word translated for worship means to prostrate oneself or to bow down. And so really what worship is to value God and to have this high view of Him and to express that through humility, to come before God and humble ourselves and to value Him and to honor Him in that. So with this view of worship in mind, let's see what emerging worship is and how it relates to this definition of biblical worship. Now we will look at a definition for emerging worship. This is not something that's easy to come by. Many people, especially within the emerging church, the emergent church movement, have a hard time defining it. That's because it often differs from person to person. Listen to what Scott McKnight, a professor for North Park University, says. It can't be simply defined. It can't be simply categorized. And it's causing no end of frustration for people who'd like to have tidier boxes. This is the way they want it because they believe the gospel should have a local expression. In an interview with George Fox Journal, Leonard Sweet said, "It probably would mean something different to everyone you would ask. But from my perspective, the emergent church is an ongoing conversation and how new times call for new churches. And that the mortar-happy church of the last half of the 20th century is ill-poised to face the promises and perils of the future." In a documentary by PBS, the narrator Kim Lawton said, "Call it what you want. The emerging church is having a big impact across denominational lines. But there are no easy labels. Participants have called themselves postmodern, post-conservative, post-liberal, post-evangelical, and post-Protestant." The problem that we run into with defining emerging worship is that it's not a centralized movement. It's a movement that has happened in different places through different people in different ways, different expressions and ideas of exactly what emerging worship is. One thing that's clear is that emerging worship has come from post-modernity. With the growing worldview of post-modernity and its influence in culture, people are changing. The way they view the world is changing. The way they interact with people and other ideas is changing. In many ways, that has an impact on Christianity. Christianity of many churches and of many people is firmly rooted in modernity. We'll talk a little bit more in a minute about the difference between modernity and post-modernity. Let's look at a definition that we'll be working with for what emerging worship is. Emerging worship is a response by some in the church to postmodern thinking and its impact on culture. It's a very broad and general definition, but when looking at emerging worship in all the forms it takes, it's important to be so general. It's not specific. It's hard to tie down. It's hard to put tight ends around. But we'll be looking at a lot of the things that are common throughout emerging worship, no matter where you're at. So we have a lot to look at, so let's get into it. Modernity and post-modernity. If you're anything like me, the first time you heard those phrases, you just felt lost and you didn't want to hear anything more about them. However, in dealing with emerging worship, understanding the difference and especially understanding what post-modernity is can be very important. I don't want to spend too much time on this topic as a A whole video, a whole lesson, a whole series of lessons could be devoted to the difference between the two. But what's very important that should be understood about modernity and postmodernity is that modernity is primarily focused on rational thinking, truth, objective truth, what can be seen, what can be proven, how can we make things tangible and clear and visible. Postmodernity is just simply what comes after modernity. So a lot of the things that modernity is concerned with, postmodernity is less concerned with. This is what has led to the rise of people holding conflicting viewpoints. Truth is often seen as relative, subjective. It's up to you. So how does the church handle postmodernity? That is what emerging worship seeks to answer. In seeking to answer this question, something is revealed about emerging worship that is different than other styles of worship that one might observe. If you go to a contemporary worship service at this time in 2018, you'll probably hear Oceans, Reckless Love, Death Was Arrested, any of these modern contemporary hits. You go to a traditional service, you're likely to hear Amazing Grace. There will be a piano, maybe an organ that will define the worship service. Preaching is sure to be central in both of these and many other forms of worship, but emerging worship is different. Its primary focus and what it exists to be is to answer that question. How do Christians engage a postmodern world? How do Christians engage people that look almost completely different than what church normally looks like? How can a worship service look like the people that are not in the worship service? Because there's been a problem in Christianity lately. Maybe you've noticed it. Younger people are leaving the church, maybe even some older people. Postmodernity is not something that is only young people. Some older people have this mindset as well. They have questions. They have questions that rational answers, the answers most people have in the church, don't answer. They have a view of spirituality and of God because they are spiritual people. But it doesn't look like going to church, standing and sitting and singing songs. So what does it mean for the postmodern person to encounter God? Emerging worship is primarily concerned with that, encountering God and creating worship services that will lead people to encounter God and to engage with God. Because of that, they look very different. They look different than a normal, or what we would call a normal worship service. Their structure is different. The atmosphere is different. The message is different. Sometimes these things are good, sometimes they're bad, and we're going to look at a lot of these different aspects. But the main thing is that they seek to engage the people. It is primarily a missional mindset. They are seeking to engage those who Christian culture and what Christian culture that exists as it does now is not engaging. That is what the heartbeat of emerging worship is. So what does emerging worship look like? Up to this point in the video, I have had good lighting on my face and on the area I'm working in, and in many ways it's like most worship services many people attend. The standard would be to have good stage lighting, adequate lighting on what's going on, and make sure everything is in the forefront. Everything is visible that needs to be visible. In emerging worship, many different expressions are used in worship. One of those expressions might be candles. Another factor at play for me right now is the scent. There's a lot of different smells that are going on, and just like maybe in the Eastern Orthodox Church, the scent, the use of smell is a part of worship. No area, no aspect is off limits when it comes to emerging worship. If God created it, it's something that can be used to glorify Him, people in emerging worship will seek to do that. The goal is to use art, light, whatever might come, whatever might be, to worship God. Now, in this, there are some things that are very different. The sermon is not necessarily the focal point. They may not be in what looks like a traditional sanctuary. It may not have a very structured order of worship. A lot of these things would be very disconcerting to many people in the church, to many people who are used to a structured, orderly service where things make sense. But to the postmodern person, to those people who have not been in church or have been disillusioned by church, this environment, this postmodern atmosphere, this emerging worship service can be quite engaging. It can be something that has a connection for them. It can be something that leads to an experience with God, which, as we mentioned, is what emerging worship is all about. The theology of the emerging worship movement is a little hard to nail down. That's because the emerging worship movement is a mindset, a way of engaging the culture rather than a denomination or a very specific and clearly defined movement. It'll depend on where you're looking at and who you're looking at. Dan Kimball, in his book, The Emerging Church, does a great job of laying out the heart behind the emerging worship, the emerging church movement. Some of the things that they are very passionate about are things that most other churches are very passionate about as well. Evangelism. They are very intentional about making evangelism be person to person and relational rather than event driven. Many of the things the emerging church seeks to do are really things that traditional and contemporary churches seem to be trying to move away from as well. Rather than being program and seeker driven, they're seeking to engage the culture. That's really what the emerging church seeks to do. And the theology behind it is what will drive the worship service and the content. They're big on spiritual formation as well. Dan Kimball makes it very clear that if the service, the gathering is the only thing that happens, then they are failing in what they are doing. The emerging worship movement has varying theology depending on where you're at. Some of it may be conservative in its theology, some of it may be very liberal. And that is one of the things that we'll discuss a little later when we get to the positives and the negatives. But overall, the theology of the emerging worship movement will depend on who you're looking at. But the heart of the movement is very much the heart of many other believers as they are seeking to find ways to engage the culture and share the gospel and to build up believers that are able to feed themselves and sustain their own growth, even though it is done in a different way than others might choose to do so. So what are the positives of the emerging church movement, the emerging worship movement? I think it'll depend on who you ask. Those within the movement may see more positives than those outside the movement. But I think regardless of who you are, you can look and see some very positive aspects dealing with the movement. I think very clearly the most positive and the most obvious positive about the movement is its heart. The reason it exists is because there is a generation that exists of people that are not being reached by the church. Now, whether the emerging worship movement is the answer, the correct answer to that problem, is up for debate. But the reason this movement exists is to reach people that were not being reached. It seeks to lead others to experience and to know God that would not know Him, maybe through traditional means. So the heart and the reasoning behind the movement is probably the greatest strength of the emerging worship movement. In a similar way, the focuses within the movement are very positive as well. As I mentioned previously, other churches, other movements, other styles are seeking to do things the emerging church is doing as well. Focusing on personal evangelism, focusing on the church body not being so focused on events and on programming, rather being focused on being outward and being missional in the community, being incarnational, and the focus on spiritual formation as well. Those focuses in the emergent church movement are very positive things about the movement. You could even go so far as to say that the style of worship change is a positive for the emerging church movement. Too often, one of the problems many churches face is unwillingness to change. Churches split all the time because people don't want to change. The most ironic thing about that is often when people don't want change, they're the ones that end up splitting and changing things because of their unwillingness to change. For example, if a church didn't want to leave a building and they left because the church was talking about building, they were no longer in the building they were in. The emerging church is challenging this mentality and stubbornness to not move on to new things. It challenges what worship is and what it can be, and challenges believers to find new ways to express their worship to God. So what are the negatives of the emerging worship movement, or the emerging church movement, or the emergent church movement, or emergence Christianity? That would be my first negative. There are so many parts and aspects and different ways of looking at things that it's just not clear. It's not clear what we're talking about. It's not clear what you're looking at. And when you use the words emerging, emergent, emergence, they get confusing and they mean different things to different people. For example, John Piper wrote an article about emergent Christianity and his concerns that he had with it. He was concerned with their lack of holding to the truth and their lack of wanting to remain firm in doctrine. But then he looked at believers like Mark Driscoll, who would be described as emerging, and he was okay with them because they held fast to the truth. That's part of the problem, is that in this movement, in the emerging church, in the emerging worship movement, it's very unclear what exactly we're talking about, or who exactly we're talking about, or what exactly they believe. It's often a game of semantics, and when semantics are at play, things get very difficult and very hard to define. So that would be the first negative of the emerging worship movement. The second would be very similar to some of the concerns that John Piper expressed. There are some within the movement that hold even more firmly to some of the postmodern views, and they question truth. What is truth? What can we know to be true? Now, sometimes that could be a good thing. As I mentioned previously, the church does not often like to change. Churches in general, people don't like to change. So sometimes questioning can be good. Maybe there are things we need to do differently. Maybe there are ways we can advance. But there are some foundational truths to Christianity that ought not be changed, that are foundational. And if they cease to be, Christianity ceases alongside them. And so there are some that question truth to the point of danger. They are questioning doctrine. They are questioning things that are very important to what it means to be a Christian. One such quote from the documentary that PBS put together on emerging Christianity is from Doug Pagitt. It says, "It is more important to feel like we are representing a beautiful expression of our life with God than it is to be right about everything." I don't know exactly what he means, but perhaps he is getting at the idea that if we love theology more than we love God, that is a bad thing. I would agree with that. If theology gets in the way of our relationship with God, it becomes an idol. But to say that theology doesn't matter and all we should do is focus on experiencing God or loving God without worrying about theology is very dangerous as well. Again, I don't know exactly what he means, but it is a view that is concerning, and it is something that is certainly apparent within the emerging church, even if that is not exactly what he meant. There are those who question and are more worried about experiencing and their thoughts and their feelings than what is clearly seen in Scripture and what is clearly known to be truth about God. And that is the danger. On the fringes of this movement, there may be those who have ceased to worship the God of the Bible and have turned and rather created gods they worship, or worshiping something that they have created rather than the God of the Bible. But I would like to focus more on the heart of the emerging worship movement, which is engaging a world and engaging people that are not being reached through traditional means. And that is what the real heart of the movement is about. So after all this, what should we think about emerging worship? What should we think about the emerging worship movement? As I've said many times before, it really depends on what exactly we are talking about. But I would like to focus on the heart of the movement and what I believe we can all learn and take away from this movement. There are people in this world who believe differently than we do. There are people in this world who have different backgrounds, different cultures. Every person has a unique experience. They are the only person that has gone through their life. Many people now are disillusioned with the church. They are post-Christian. They have no dealings with Christianity. They have no dealings with the church. And many of them are unwilling, are not wanting to come to the church. The problem is too often the church says, come here and look like us. Emerging worship, emerging church, emerging Christianity takes the opposite approach. It goes to people and begins to look like they do. That is where emerging worship does best. And that is what we can all learn and take away from emerging worship. When it comes to engaging culture, when it comes to engaging people for the gospel, for the sake of Christ, to the glory of God, that is something emerging worship does very, very well. And I would argue better than many churches in the United States. Because too often we are concerned with our own preferences, concerned with what we like, concerned with things that we want. And when we do that, we fail in reaching people. We fail in fulfilling the Great Commission to go and make disciples. We should begin to look at the culture around us and figure out how we can best reach those people with the gospel. And here's where we also must look at emerging Christianity to learn another lesson. We must always remain firm on the truth. We must remain firm in our convictions. Truth is there. Truth is real. And there are truths that we cannot compromise. So we must engage the culture. We must do things maybe differently than we've ever done them before for the sake of the gospel. But in doing so, we must remain firm and remain firmly planted on the truth of the gospel and the truths of Scripture, and not lose that in reaching the world. So let's be encouraged by emerging Christianity, by people that are seeking God and seeking to bring others to Him. Maybe it's different than we've done it. Maybe it's different than our grandparents did it. But in many ways, we can learn from them and we can join them in a mission to reach the world for Christ. At this point, we've reached the end of our discussion about emerging worship. I'd like to take this time to challenge you. If you're in a group or you're with some people, there's going to be some questions that you're going to see. I would encourage you to look at those, to think about them, discuss them with your group. If you're alone, if you're viewing this by yourself, take some time and think over these questions. Look over them. You'll also see some resources that I've used to help me in putting this together that may be beneficial to go and do some further research. We've only done a brief overview as is to go into all of what emerging worship is and all of the factors and all of the things that played into it will take a very long time. So if you're interested in this subject and you want to learn more, consult those sources. They'd be very beneficial to you. But let us all remember our mission to reach this world for Christ, and let's see how we can do it best together.